Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we do it around here. We take a bunch of stuff and we pull out the most interesting bits just for you.
That's right. And today we're diving into Bharani Nakshatra.
Bharani, yeah. Sometimes it gets this label, the star of restraint, but honestly, that just scratches the
Oh
surface.
yeah, big time.
We've got a whole collection of astrological discussions, some really insightful videos from experts, even delved into some of the old stories. And what we want to do today is go way beyond just that simple label. We want to unearth the real symbolism and the significance of Bharani,
That's the goal.
because it's a lot more than just one thing.
Absolutely. And it's funny, as we were going through all this, it really struck me how that restraint thing actually becomes way more interesting when you start digging deeper.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like there's this kind of reserved, even quiet outer layer, but underneath there's this whole intricate dynamic energy going
I
on.
like that. And, it feels like the perfect place to start is with the deity that's associated with Bharani, Yama.
Right. Makes sense?
Now, I know for some people, just hearing that name, Yama, might bring up some, well, let's say, less than pleasant associations.
Yeah, I can see that.
But one of the things that really stood out in the material we looked at was how important it is to see past those initial, surface level fears.
Yeah.
Because in essence, Yama plays this super vital, even auspicious role in how the whole cosmos operates.
Oh, yeah, totally. And what's really key here is that Purani, because it's ruled by Yama, isn't just about endings, it's about the impermanence of all beginnings. Like everything that's born already has the seed of its eventual end built in.
Hmm.
So Purani is like this powerful reminder that things are always in flux, that things are changing. It helps us appreciate the present moment within that constant cycle of birth, growth, death, rebirth.
Right, it's not just focused on the conclusion.
Exactly. And, the way it was described in one source, it's like Yama is this guiding intelligence that is deeply, deeply concerned with maintaining balance.
Balance, yeah.
And it's not just balance for humans. There's compassion for all living beings. Like,
No.
there are stories about karmic repercussions, even for harming animals.
Yeah.
So it's really about maintaining equilibrium across the entire cosmic system.
That's huge.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile this image of balance and compassion with, the more, let's say, formidable side of Yama?
Right. Well, I think understanding one of Yama's other names might help. Kala,
Kala.
which translates to time. And time, let's be real, is one of the most powerful, all-encompassing forces there is. And Yama presides over the end of every cycle of time. Even beings like Brahma and Indra at the end of cosmic ages come under Yama's domain.
So it's not just about death. It's about the end of everything.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've got Yama as the deity, this force for balance, the ender of time, the guardian of the south. And then we've got this associated Shakti, described as smoky-colored.
Yeah, smoky colored.
And there are these various realms connected to Yama, Yamapuri, Yamaloka. And one of the things that really struck me was this parallel they drew between the 28 levels in some descriptions of these realms and the 28 nakshatras.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like a mirror,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then there's this other thing about how, in the older understanding of Yama, it wasn't so much about punishment, the way we might think of it today. It was more about purifying consciousness after life.
Oh, I see.
So regardless of what you did in your life, good or bad, the idea was to clear away all the residual energies from that existence to prepare the consciousness to move on.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, totally shifts the perspective, doesn't it?
For sure.
And one of the sources suggested that to really grasp the essence of Yama, we should look at an incarnation in one of the major epics.
Oh.
This incarnation was known for being incredibly wise, offering guidance even when things seem totally hopeless. And when we see Yama through that lens, as this wise counselor, it really moves us away from just seeing them as the bringer of death.
Makes sense. Because if we step back and think about it in the bigger picture, that unwavering commitment to Dharma, to doing what's right, even when facing immense challenges, gives us a whole different insight into what Yama is really about. It's not just ending things, it's about upholding cosmic law.
Wow, I like that. And then there was this other interesting thing, symbolic representations of Yama, like Yama becoming the tip of Shiva's arrow. And there was also a brief mention of a Tibetan concept about, guidance at the end of life.
Right.
Which totally makes sense with Yama's domain.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it seems like really understanding Yama goes beyond just reading about it.
Oh, yeah. For sure. This actually brings up something really important about knowledge itself.
Oh, yeah.
Like, one of the sources emphasized that just having information about something doesn't mean you truly understand it.
Right, you got to live it.
Exactly. Real knowledge comes from experience, through practices like meditation, through union, through actually embodying the essence of these principles.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and dive into the symbolism of Bharani itself. The primary symbol is the downward-facing triangle,
Okay.
also known as the yoni, which is the female reproductive organ. Now, when we think of the yoni, it immediately brings to mind that idea of restraint, right?
Sure.
The uterus holding and containing new life.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But here's the interesting thing. There's this paradox. Because while the womb represents containment, Bharani as a nakshatra is more about freedom and release.
Oh, wow.
So it's like that initial restraint is actually in service of creating something new, a new beginning, a new cycle.
That is interesting.
And the womb is literally the seat of reincarnation. It's where a soul starts a new journey, a new time frame.
Right.
And that name, stark restraint, it can also be seen as holding potential. It's not just taking things away. It's also about being able to move forward into something new.
I see. So it's about the potential for both endings and beginnings.
Exactly.
Okay, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, let's look at the astronomical details for a second. Bharani is connected to 3 stars in the constellation Aries.
Okay.
And there was this mention that around 1600, 700 BCE, the vernal equinox actually took place within Bharani.
Hmm.
And that time period coincides with some major developments that happened along the Indus River.
Oh, so we're bringing in that water element.
Exactly, water and new beginnings.
I like it.
And it's also interesting to note that out of these 3 stars, one of them is called the Yogatara. And that one specifically is really prominent in shaping the energy of Bharani.
Which ties in perfectly with that Hindi word, Bharani, which means an earthen pot.
Right, another vessel, another symbol of holding and containing.
Yeah, so we've got this recurring theme of containment, whether it's a baby in the womb, water in a pot. And then there's that idea of, as you sow, so shall you reap. That's associated with Bharani.
Right, which connects back to that theme of law and justice we were talking about with Yama.
Exactly. Like, there are consequences for our actions.
Yeah.
Bharani seems to be really tuned into that karmic principle of cause and effect.
Yeah, I'm seeing that.
Yeah. Now let's bring in a few other deities and concepts that are linked to Bharani. Rahu, for example, is said to have a strong connection.
Okay.
But one of the sources offered a really interesting, almost like alternative take on Rahu's story. You know, the one with Mohini and the distribution of the nectar?
Yeah.
Well, in this version, they really emphasized Rahu's sobriety and this deep sense of fairness. Like, it wasn't about greed, it was about recognizing injustice and trying to maintain balance.
Oh, I see.
And then there's the whole symbolism of Rahu's beheading and becoming immortal.
Right.
Instead of being a punishment, this source presented it as a liberation.
Liberation.
Yeah, liberation from the limitations of the intellect and the physical senses, which ultimately connects to the concept of moksha.
Wow, that's deep.
Yeah, so transcending the limitations of the ordinary mind.
And you know, if we connect this to like lived experience, it's interesting how they mentioned that people with strong Bharani placements often find themselves caring for parents who have sensory impairments.
Oh, wow, that's a cool connection.
Yeah, like another way that theme of the senses and their transcendence might play out.
We also touched on Saturn being debilitated in Aries, which is the sign where Bharani is located.
Right.
And that was presented as something to think about in terms of needing restraint and slowing down, be more deliberate with your energy.
Makes sense.
And then there's the strong connection to Shakti.
The divine feminine energy, yeah.
And that specifically, they highlighted powerful goddesses like Kali and Bhadrakali in the ancient Tamil scriptures.
Okay.
These goddesses represent primordial energy, like the source of all creation, the source of fertility.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. And this connection extends to all those significant spiritual sites. Like, they even mentioned that one temple dedicated to a powerful form of Shakti. Yeah, that's right.
So there's this clear link between Bharani and that raw, primal, creative force.
Right.
Oh, and there was also a saying from, I think it was Tamil in Canada, about how people born under Bharani will rule the world.
Oh, wow.
Which symbolizes the fertility and power of Mother Earth. And they connected this to the birth of Krishna. And then they went on to talk about why Krishna, who's often depicted with a darker complexion, has a Shani influence.
Okay.
and how that big war in the Mahabharata, which is all about ending cycles, lasted for 18 days, which is this really significant number.
That's fascinating how it all ties together. Like, we're seeing all these threads connecting Bharani to fertility, to power, to justice, to endings. It's all woven together.
Yeah, it's not just one thing.
Not at all.
And then they brought up the ancient fire festivals that celebrated fertility, which coincided with the sun's transit through Bharani. So now we've got those themes of summer, fire, new beginnings.
Right.
And we can't forget about Appa, the water element, which is also associated with Bharani.
Yeah, to water.
And that symbolism of water ties in perfectly with purification, with those rituals where you're immersed in water.
Right. Baptism.
Exactly. And that idea of rebirth, which, it doesn't just happen when we're born, it can happen throughout our lives.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so let's shift gears again and talk about some of the stories associated with Bharani.
Okay.
There's the one about this really wise sage and a young seeker who went to confront Yama, the Lord of Death. And the story focuses on the 3 wishes that Yama granted.
3 wishes. Okay.
And I was thinking, maybe those wishes connect back to the 3 stars of Bharani?
Maybe.
And they touch on those themes of self-knowledge, understanding death, and finding inner peace.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And if we connect this to what we were talking about before, it's all about that persistent seeking of wisdom, even when you're facing death head on.
Right.
And then there's the story of Savitri and Satyavan. This devoted wife, through her intelligence and determination, gets Yama to grant her 3 boons.
3 again. Interesting. Right. And those boons end up indirectly bringing her husband back to life.
Okay.
And then there's the story about Markandeya, this young devotee who's destined to die at the age of 16.
Yeah.
But he's protected by Yama.
Yeah.
And that number, 16, is super significant.
16, yeah.
And then there's another story about a prince who was also supposed to die at 16.
Oh, wow.
But his wife prevents his death through her devotion and by using a lamp.
Interesting.
Again, emphasizing the number 16.
Okay.
And they connected this to the 4th house in Vedic astrology,
The 4th house, okay.
which represents both the womb and the tomb.
The beginning and the end.
Exactly, like
Yeah.
the entire span of a lifetime.
I see.
And even one of the aspects of Ganesha, specifically the 4th aspect, is associated with Yama. Can you talk a little bit about what those aspects represent and why the 4th one is linked to Yama?
Sure. In this tradition, each aspect of a deity represents a different facet of creation and consciousness. And the 4th aspect is usually associated with grounding, with the material world, which naturally includes that whole cycle of birth and death. So that's why it's connected to Yama.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So all these stories, even though they're centered on mortality, they're really highlighting the power of devotion, wisdom, and this constant cycle of life and renewal.
It's not just about endings, right? It's about what comes after.
Exactly.
So how does all of this play out in actual human experience? How do these Bharani energies manifest?
Right, right. Well, based on some stories about Yama's interactions with their sibling, Yami, there might be some challenges around working together,
Okay.
especially in family dynamics.
Yeah.
And they talked about how even Yama had trouble carrying out their duties sometimes.
So even the Lord of Death struggles.
Yeah, it seems like even for divine beings, maintaining balance and order is complex.
That's reassuring in a way.
Right, like it's not easy for anyone.
Exactly.
And then there's this concept of dharma sankat,
Dharma Sankha.
which is basically a moral dilemma where you're forced to compromise your values.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, and they said this is something that people with strong Bharani influence might face more often.
I can see that.
And it all goes back to Bharani being that star of restraint, that power to take away that foundation for ending cycles.
So it makes sense that those tough choices, those moments where you have to decide what you're willing to let go of, would be more prominent.
Exactly. And then they talked about how certain natural laws are withheld,
Okay.
hidden by Yama and this scribe called Chitragupta.
Chitragupta.
Yeah, and there's that story about how Brahma created Chitragupta to help Yama because there was so much work and so many errors happening.
Wow. So record keeping, secrets, accountability, those are all part of it too.
Yeah, and they connected that to professions like lawyers and judges, bringing back that theme of law and justice.
That's interesting. It's like Bharani embodies both the ultimate cosmic order and our human attempts to reflect that order in our legal systems.
Yeah, it's both the big picture and the day-to-day.
Right.
Oh, and they also mentioned that Bharani has a link to creativity and the arts,
Okay.
especially dancers. They often have a prominent Bharani placement in their charts.
Hmm.
And then, of course, we talked about the powerful forces of birth and death, which are beyond our control. But also how Bharani isn't just about endings. It's about transformation and new beginnings.
Right.
It's like those two forces, creation and destruction, they're totally intertwined. And Bharani embodies that constant state of change, that dance between the two.
That makes a lot of sense.
They also introduced this concept of completion karma, which is basically where major karmic patterns come to an end, making way for new beginnings.
Oh, wow.
Like, imagine graduating from a major life chapter.
I like that.
Yeah. And then they talked about how people with strong Bharani influence might experience grief that's related to people who are still alive.
Okay.
Or they might have to let go of old ways of seeing things.
So it's about letting go, about releasing what's no longer serving you,
Exactly.
which can be really tough.
Oh, for sure.
But it's also incredibly liberating.
Yeah. And finally, there's that capacity for discernment that comes with Bharani,
Right.
but also the potential to be really judgmental, which they said is something that can evolve over time.
I see.
And they talked about the importance of water, specifically rivers like the Yamuna, for clearing Bharani karma,
Okay.
and how rituals, especially during certain astrological periods, can be really beneficial.
So like dips in sacred rivers.
Exactly. And it seems like these waterways have this underestimated power to help us cleanse and release those stagnant energies. When they talk about clearing Bharani karma through water, what kind of impact might that have on a person?
It's often seen as a way to release past burdens and purify your emotional and energetic bodies, which can lead to a greater sense of freedom and renewal.
So it's not just physical cleansing, it's deeper than that.
Right. It's about aligning with Bharani's energy of transformation and new beginnings.
Okay, and finally, they listed some potential professions or areas of interest for people with strong Bharani influence.
Right.
Those who help with transitions, like birth and death, people in law enforcement, and those who deal with secrets or record keeping.
It's interesting to think about how these cosmic influences can give us insight into our own paths.
Right, like maybe it could even help us understand why we're drawn to certain things.
Absolutely.
So to recap our deep dive into Bharani, we've explored its deep connection to Yama, that deity of time and transformation.
Right.
And that central symbolism of restraint and release really shows us how cyclical existence is, encompassing birth, death, and everything in between.
Yeah, and it highlights how beginnings and endings are always intertwined.
Bharani is so much more than just a star of restraint. It's a connection to those fundamental rhythms of the cosmos. And it's about that constant striving for balance and justice. So I'm curious, for you, thinking about those times when you've had to make those really tough choices, do you think the influence of Bharani might be at play, like this internal struggle to hold on to your values, even when it's hard?
That's a great question. And for you listening, how does all of this resonate with your own life? What parts of Bharani's energy stand out to you the most?
And one final thought to leave you with. How do those seemingly opposite forces of restraint and liberation show up in your own journey of growth, in your own unique destiny?
It's definitely something worth exploring further.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
We encourage you to keep thinking about these ideas and maybe even revisit the things that initially sparked your interest with this new understanding.
And who knows, maybe Bharani will reveal even more of its secrets to you.